So today we're going to be talking about normal, dominant, and recessive traits. First, I want to introduce you to a man named Gregor Mendel. Mendel is considered the father of genetics because of his studies on pea plants and their inheritance patterns. He found that there are dominant and recessive traits. This is important because before Mendel's experiments, people thought that inheritance was a blend of both parents, which he proved wrong. There are a few definitions I want you to write down on your worksheet. Genetics, which is the study of heredity, and heredity, which is the passing of traits from parent to offspring. Go ahead and pause this video in order to write these words down. So in Mendel's experiment, he studied seed shape, seed color, flower color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and then stem height. We're going to focus on Mendel's experiment with the seed shape. He crossed a flower that produces a wrinkled seed and a flower that produces a smooth seed. We are going to call this the P generation, P meaning parental. And what he noticed from the first generation, which we're going to call F1, is that 100% of the time the flowers produce smooth seeds. What he did next was he crossed two of the first generations to see what would happen. And so the second generation, which we call F2, he found that 75% of the time the pea plants produced smooth seeds, and 25% of the time they were wrinkled. So what exactly does this mean, smooth versus wrinkled? He found that the smooth seed trait actually covered up the wrinkled trait. So we call this dominant versus recessive. So a few more definitions I want you to write down. First one's going to be dominant, is when a genetic trait is expressed phenotypically in either a heterozygous or homozygous individual. Recessive is when a genetic trait is expressed phenotypically only when the individual is homozygous. But we need to look at what some of these words mean. For example, phenotypically, how about heterozygous or homozygous? We're going to explore these a little bit more. So the definition for phenotype is the physical characteristics of an individual. This is what we see as a result of the genotype, which the genotype is the genes that the individual has. So phenotype being physical characteristics and genotype being the genes. So in a heterozygous individual, hetero meaning different, you're having two different copies of an allele, while in a homozygous individual, homo meaning same, you have two of the same copies of an allele. But what exactly does an allele mean? And we need to explore this a little bit more. So in order to understand what an allele is, I'm going to use an example of a mom and a dad. So for your mom, she has 23 sets of chromosomes, which makes up a total of 46 chromosomes. Your dad also has 46 chromosomes. Notice that your mom has two X's, which make her female, and your dad has an X and a Y, which make him male. But for right now, I'm just going to focus on chromosomes from your mom and chromosomes for your dad. So I'm going to go ahead and take these, and I'm going to redraw these in a different format so they're easier to understand. So as an example, we're going to use chromosomes from your mom and chromosomes for your dad. So these are considered homologous chromosomes because they are chromosomes from different parents but contain similar genes. Go ahead and pause this video in order to write down this definition on your worksheet. So on each of these chromosomes, we're going to say that each chromosome from your mom and from your dad contain a gene for eye color. But on your mom's chromosome, she might have the allele for blue eyes, while your dad has alleles for brown eyes. So a few more definitions. The first one being a gene, which is a unit of heredity that contains the code to make a protein that determines a specific characteristic. But what exactly is a characteristic? It could be brown hair, blue eyes, light skin, big nose. So these are the things that we can physically see. So a gene has a code that makes a protein which shows a characteristic, whereas the allele is different forms of a gene that are found at the same place on a chromosome. So back to your mom and dad example. Your mom has the allele for blue eyes. We're going to call this little b because it's recessive. Your dad has the allele for brown eyes. We're going to call this big B because it's dominant. So next we're going to make Punnett squares. We're going to cross dad's big B with mom's little b. Notice that the big B's are going to go down into each box, like so. Next we're going to take the little b, and those are also going to go down into each box. So in this Punnett square, we have the parental generation, which is mom and dad, and then you have your first generation, which are the offspring. We're going to go ahead and focus on the first generation. Notice there's a big B, which is dominant, and a little b, which is recessive. So this dominant big B is actually covering up the traits of the recessive little b. So now what we're going to do is we're going to cross two individuals from the F1 generation, or first generation. So each of the parents has a big B, little b. So we're going to go ahead and do our crosses, bring down the B's, and then now we're going to examine what we have made. So we have a homozygous dominant, which is a big B, or we have a heterozygous individual, which is a big B, little b, and then we also have a homozygous recessive, which is little b. So we're going to look at these a little bit more. Notice that 3 out of 4 times, which is 75%, there is brown eyes in the offspring, which is big B or big B, little b. And then for the blue eyes, it only happens 1 out of 4 times, which is 25%. And we're going to call this little b. So remember that the brown eyes and blue eyes are the phenotypes, and that the genotypes are going to be the B's. So that concludes our normal, dominant, and recessive trait discussion.